Welcome Divyanshi ji. Namaste. I'm Kiran Singh, coordinator of Sri Aurobindo Life Center at AURO University. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar organized under Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center, titled Rhythm and Flow in Integral Education. Today's webinar will introduce participants to integral education, which is part of an active program running at AURO University. AURO University's Integral Life Center. During our webinar series, some of you asked to conduct the webinar on education. On our lecture series, our earlier lecture was on compassionate system framework, which was on one of the many approaches to educational pedagogy. We received numerous questions and interest on other educational approaches. Hence, we continue to invite scholars on the topic to discuss new perspective on education. At SAIIER Center, our integral education program's goal is to work on transformation that brings about Purna or integral inner growth of all individuals, including mental, vital, physical aspects of being. This webinar is timely in that we need integral learning to not only survive in the outer environment, but remain strong at inner level as well. Before we begin our webinar, I would like to share a few words on Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center. The center is dedicated to Sri Aurobindo and in realizing his vision and thought on integral life. The center's goal is to foster inquiry and new thinking in academia, public discourse, business, law, politics, economics, science, and technology in the light of Sri Aurobindo's integral world vision. Our core learning and research areas include integral education, integral yoga, integral psychology, and integral art. We are actively working on integral education program and foundation of Indian culture as well as Sri Aurobindo studies at AURO University. The center operates on the vision of Honorable Sri H.V. Ramaji, founder president AURO University. AURO University, founded by a Rama family, is inspired by the vision and teaching of Sri Aurobindo and Mother. As the goal of SAILC include providing a platform for the exchange of best practices in the implementation of integral education, the webinar today will provide an enriching experience for all our audience members and participants who have joined us from around the world. We are honored to have Divyanshi ji, who will deliver this talk and address us on the rhythm and flow in the integral education. Divyanshi ji, I must introduce Divyanshi ji. Divyanshi ji studied at Lady Shri Ram College and University of Oxford, and now she is working out of Auroville. At Auroville, she is an executive of Auroville Campus Initiative, ACI, SAIIER, Department of Further Learning. She is also involved in program and curriculum design, facilitation, and organizational management. She has been designing and facilitating several self-development programs for youth based on the integral paradigm of psychology, yoga, and education, grounded in the box of Sri Aurobindo and Mother. Swadhyay and Swadharma are some of her popular programs that are based on Sri Aurobindo's vision. In a way, she is my guru also because I am also learning under her and I have taken that Swadhyay program. Please join me in welcoming Vice Chancellor Dr. Rajan Velukarji, AURO University, and Dr. Rohit Singh ji, Dean of Academics at AURO University. May I request Rohit ji, please give your welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for organizing this session, that too by a known person among us, Divyanshi. Divyanshi, thank you so much for accepting our request and being with us. For the audience to know, AURO University is trying to bring the integral education into our regular curriculum process. And though there are a lot of institutions which are helping in the embedding of integral education at the school level, there are very few which are trying to integrate into the higher education system. With us, Divyanshi is helping us to train the trainer program by training the faculty members and the staff members who are interested to take along this integral education program at the university. Recently, under the coordinatorship of the Auroville Campus Initiative, AURO University has undertaken few teachers training program at the Auroville, and we are now bringing that element of learning into our daily teaching learning pedagogy tools into the university system. The purpose of bringing Divyanshi today is that Divyanshi will also help the audience to understand how these different aspects, the 4 different elements, can be brought into our daily teaching learning process. And I am very much sure the way Divyanshi will tell people and the audience, you will definitely get a clue how these things can be really brought into our teaching learning, which can be then transformed to the students who are ultimately into our classroom teaching learning process. So thank you so much, Divyanshi. Looking forward to the session and hope the audience and you will enjoy the session. Over to you, Kiran ma'am.
Thank you, Rohit sir. Before we begin, I would like to encourage all in the audience to participate today by asking questions. To do that, please type question in the chat box at any time during the talk. We'll keep track of all questions and share them at the end of the webinar. And now, Divyanshi ji, may I request you to address our audience. Over to you.
Thank you, Kiran, and thank you, Rohit, for a very beautiful introduction. So today we will be focusing on the flow and rhythm in integral education. I will be sharing a PPT, so I won't be having access to your questions during my presentation, but certainly after the around 30 to 40 minute long presentation, we will be getting into question and answers. With that, I begin. Okay, so I guess you guys are able to see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so rhythm and flow in integral education. I'd like to begin with sharing a little anecdote. So Kiran approached me around this topic of rhythm and flow, structure or spontaneity, discipline and freedom. And especially because it's really like a hot ground of a battle in integral education, because in mainstream the tilt or the bent is more towards, one can say, discipline, structure, organization, whereas in integral education, because the aim is a integral development of the being, and that too in a paradigm of free progress, the tilt is more towards freedom and free setup. And so the question sometimes occurs that in the mainstream sometimes systems become too rigid, that it's difficult for the flow to happen, whereas on the other hand, what can happen potentially is sometimes things can become way too fluid and way too chaotic in the name of freedom. So how do we strike a balance, and more than a balance, a harmony between rhythm and flow? And interestingly, Kiranji asked me to kind of write a little note around this subject. And when I wrote, I sort of wrote it as that flow is our goal and rhythm is the context to enable that flow. And I saw like a little note on Facebook on Auroville University's page, and it was put the other way around, which is that how can we have the flow that enables us to be organized and be on track? And that is a little instance for us to kind of reflect on what is the ultimate goal or the purpose that we are seeking through integral education. Because if we put rhythm or organization as the goal, then the orientation would be different. Whereas if we put flow as the goal, then the orientation would be different. How I am going to be looking at it in this presentation is really that rhythm is the context, it's the structures, it's the discipline, is the banks of the river that allows the river to flow. So the way I am looking at is flow. I mean, at the highest level is really the divine flow, but really for the flow of life to spontaneously happen from a higher and a deeper aspiration. And how can we put in place structures or create a fertile ground for that to happen? So with that we begin. I know some of of our listeners today are not from an integral education background, but I think that's an entire field into itself that you would have to study. But I can probably begin with giving a little introduction that integral education, unlike the mainstream paradigm of education, not just focuses on mental education, it not just focuses on the academics, but on different parts of being, be it the body, be it the energies, the emotions, which is called in integral education as the vital, or the mental development, or the psychic. The psychic is essentially the true self, the core of one's being, which we call, loosely speaking, as the soul, the individual soul in being. So a development which is led by the psychic and spiritual. So these are the five-fold framework which form integral education. Of course, if you do not have a background in integral education, you will have to kind of do your own research with regard to that, because that's not the focus of today's webinar. But if I can give you essentially around these three instrumental parts of being, which is the physical, the emotional, and the mental, the aim of integral education is to bring the psychic or the deeper self or the soul to the forefront. And then there are three principles of integral education, which is that, the teacher, even the word teacher is not appropriate. The teacher, quote unquote, the facilitator, is a guide or a helper. She's not here to impart or instruct. And this is a very, very key principle. It's a paradigm shift from how universities traditionally have operated and have been looked up to. Because in the traditional paradigm, the assumption is that there is the knowledge and university knows it. Whereas here, the university turns into a helper and a guide that enables the learner to discover that knowledge from within. So here the assumption is, who knows? It's the student who knows. And then the second is, you consult the learner's mind in his or her own growth. And the third is, you work from near to the far, to things which are more contextual around the learner, to things which are more abstract. So that's just for our listeners today who do not have a background in integral education. With that, I begin. So today what I will be exploring, as I mentioned, is this apparent tension between structure and spontaneity, between discipline and freedom. However, if you really look at it, it's only an apparent contradiction. It's only an apparent tension. Whereas in reality, the two are really complementary. Because if you truly define discipline is really the discipline to follow the law of truth. And freedom is freedom from inner bondages. So inner freedom from the inner attachments, from desires, from impulses, really creates a context to be able to be disciplined in the direction of one's own truth, of one's own dharma in the world. And at the same time, discipline has the possibility to really create structures, to really create that context for that flow of freedom to take place, for that actual inner liberation to really take place. So with that, I'll begin with the analogy of the river. A river can flow because the banks hold its shore. Now, if you notice, to most of you, if I show this image, you will see that, if I ask you what you see, you'll say, you see a river. But actually what you see is the banks and the river. So river is actually the invisible part that is allowing the river to flow. And often in integral education, our focus is so much on flow because we really want to touch that flow state. And our focus is so much on emergence that we miss out that, in order to enable that flow and emergence, there is a holding which is happening. There's an invisible holding which is happening, and that is what is being done by the banks of the river. So what makes a river flow? The banks of the river is what makes the river flow. It is what gives it the discipline, the structure, the rhythm. And if you look at the role that the banks of the river are playing, it's essentially holding, It's holding it's being invisible, but invisibly it's holding the space for the river to flow. It is supporting the river. The banks are made for the river and not the other way down. So the role of the banks is always supportive, and that's one thing that, as facilitators we should keep in mind, that our role is always supportive. It's not like we know and we are here to impart knowledge. It's not like that. It's more so that we are the supportive system for the river to flow. We are the supportive system for the children to bloom. The center in education, in integral education, is the student, and not in that sense the university. It's not in that sense the education we feel we want to impart. In fact, the very premise of integral education is that all knowledge lies within. So what you are trying to do is you're trying to make those banks, you're trying to play that supportive role of the banks of the river. And then if you notice, the banks of the river, they really also direct the flow of the river. So not just that they're holding and supporting the river, but somewhere they're also assuming the responsibility for the river to flow in a certain direction. And that in integral education would be the direction of the psychic or the direction of the soul. And that is also the responsibility of the facilitator, to be able to crisply articulate the goals and the objectives as it is in the direction of the manifestation of truth. And the last objective or the last function that the banks of a river play is that they contain it from overflowing. And that's the last role of a facilitator. Not the last, but that's the fourth role of a facilitator, is to make sure that the space is contained, that it's not overflowing. By what do I mean in practical ways by the space, the river is not overflowing, is to be able to create a space, where there is sufficient space for, say, expressions of emotions, where there is sufficient space for expressions of individuality, but at the same time making sure that that does not hijack the collective space that one is holding. Another parallel to draw is in the context of, say, a classroom or the teaching space, the learning space. More appropriate would be to say the learning space. The banks of the river would be the direction you set your course for. So having that clarity of purpose, goal and objective, and that's how you direct actually the banks of the river in an actual classroom setting. So having that clarity that, what is this course meant for? And the second is choice. So by choice, I mean that is the direction in which the river is moving. And the students who've come to study, are they here to study what I have to teach? Because that's extremely, extremely critical. I mean, there is no integral education if that element of a true choice doesn't exist. And that's where the choice is critical. That is it really, really something that is coming from within, that is alive for the student? Is the choice to do the course and the reasons for it, is that coming from within? I mean, if a student is really studying in order to, externally, say, earn money or to get fame and recognition, or the teacher is teaching for money or for fame and recognition or because of earning livelihood, all of these become like crutches in the process. And that is the fundamental where one needs to ensure or begin with, is that is it really coming from the interest of the student? Is it really coming from the interest of the teacher to teach? So that is the foundation that makes the banks of the river in a classroom. And then, of course, schedule. How you weave the schedule, how you weave the time journey in a way that progresses in the direction of the purpose, goal and objective. And then regularity, which is following through upon one's commitment. Now, what stops a river from flowing? So what stops a river from flowing is essentially when, there is rigidity, when the banks are too stiff, or when there is a dam. So in the context of the learning space, what this means is when, the structures or the schedule or the curriculum that's made to be too rigid, it's too stiff, that does not allow for fluidity and the flexibility of the river to happen. And a dam would be when it encounters an obstacle. So an obstacle in the context of a learning space would be, for instance, if it could be also, you know how there is a saying that one fish can dirty the entire ocean. So it could also mean that, you know, a dam, for instance, could be if I, as a facilitator, say I'm holding a grudge against one of my students. Actually, that can become like a big grudge. So anything that kind of causes like a big obstacle in the collective secret space that I'm holding, that really acts as a dam. And then no water is also when the river stops flowing. So when does no water happen in a learning space? When there is no space for the deeper emotion to be expressed, when there's no space for reflection, when there's no space for sharing in a learning space, that's when the river becomes dry. And that's pretty much the nature of the modern academic setting, that it's mostly very, very dry. There is no space to truly be able to express oneself. And then the other extreme, I mean, one is that, you know, the river becomes dry and there's no water and that's how it stops flowing. The other is that, you know, it becomes overwhelmed, which is wild water uncontained by the banks, which is another side of the mistake often made in integral education, is because there is so much of focus on freedom. Sometimes what it becomes is the freedom to follow one's impulses and desires, and that really becomes like wild water. And then it's very difficult to contain wild water through these banks, through, you know, simple schedule structure, because what you have kind of opened up is the tap of all kinds of impulses, all kinds of desire entering that sacred learning space. Essentially, in brief, the dam that stops the river from flowing, on one hand, in summary, is false freedom, which is freedom to follow one's desires, impulses. On the other hand is a false discipline, which is when the structure itself becomes the goal, which is, you know, the goal of education becomes the degree, becomes the examination, becomes the job, rather than the true and integral development. So that really becomes the dam on the flow of the river. Now, you cannot honor the river at the same time. So it's very important to remember, in this play between the river and the banks, it's important to remember you cannot honor the river if you do not honor its banks. Now, banks is really that invisible space. Another analogy that I'll draw, this is of a dancer. So, you know, when a dancer dances, all what we see on stage is, you know, sheer beauty and delight, and such a flow is what we see as audience. But what really goes behind it is really the dancer hitting the feet at the right beat. Hitting each beat in the dance is a practice that a dancer has mastered, that creates that base for that abhinaya, for that beauty, for that delight to naturally happen through dance. So what is the role of a beat in dance is, it is something that helps keep the rhythm, it is something that helps keep the melodic structure, it is something that anchors for all the faculties in use. So in dance, there is quite a number of faculties that are in use, be it that of listening to music, be it that of bodily coordination, eye-hand coordination. So there are different faculties which are in use in dance, and the beat in dance is what keeps it anchored. So similarly, the elements of discipline in a learning space is what keeps it anchored. It is what gives it that rhythm to allow it to flow. And then if you notice, the beat in dance is actually very cyclical. So even though usually the beat in dance is, you know, imagined, interpreted to be very rigid and very linear, and that's usually also the perception of classical dance that we have, that, you know, it's very, very very rigid. But actually not. If you look at, you know, each, you know, in dance also, the beats together form an avartan, which is a cycle. And the way the beats work in dance is through cycles. And the last thing that the beat in dance enables one to do is it brings precision in dance movements. So similarly, in a learning space, when one hits the beat at the right time, when one is able to have that framework of discipline, what it allows you to do, it allows you to be very, very precise in terms of the progress in integral education. Now, what happens when you go off the beat in dance? Essentially, there's no coordination, there's no harmony. The delight fades. No matter how spectacular your expressions, your abhinay, the delight fades because you're not hitting the right beat, and then you get dispersed, you get all over the place. Now, this is exactly what happens when you're not able to hit the beat at the right time in a learning space. When in a learning space, you're going off the beat. By off the beat, I mean not able to keep the rhythm of being on time, the rhythm of discipline, of regularity, of commitment. And this is exactly what happens, that even though your goal is to go towards harmony and coordination and delight, it all begins to fade away. So that is the exact role of the structure of the discipline in integral education. So essentially it boils down to two elements. One is that of holding space, the second is that of emergence. So our structure or our discipline is the holding of the space. It is literally like the banks of the river. It is the invisible backbone, and what allows out of that, what happens out of that is the emergence. And often, because probably I come from an alternative setup, I see that there's a lot of focus on emergence, because that's the exciting part of things, no? The flow and the emergence and the freedom, that's the exciting part of things. And whereas one forgets that that flow is able to happen because behind it there is a lot of hard work. There's a lot of work that goes into holding space. So emergence and flow is what really comes through. What you do is you become that invisible backbone. And it's I mean, for those of you who are from India, I mean, you must have participated in a havan. So in a havan, there is the ahuti that you put in the fire, and then at the end of the havan, each one of us gets the prasad. But the exciting part about the havan always seems like the halwa that you're going to get at the end of the havan. The sweet that you're going to get at the end of it, the process of the havan itself includes the offering to the fire. So your offering to the fire is a visible backbone. As a facilitator, how can you be that invisible backbone that allow that emergence to take place? So now we are going to be looking into what I mean by holding space. So by holding space, I essentially mean that, if you can imagine, I mean, in the beginning, imagine that you are the invisible infinity that is holding space. I don't know if you felt this, but, the times when you're deeply listening to somebody, when, you're not trying to pass judgments, when you're not, in your own thoughts, when you're not, trying to judge every line that is coming at you, and you're there just simply to hold space and to just simply listen as to what does the other person truly have to say. And at that time, you really feel like that vast ocean in which all the emotions can dissolve. Or, if you've encountered somebody who's deeply listened to you, you would always feel that, with whatever emotions you go to that person, with whatever problems, struggles, it all dissolves into that vast ocean. And what that other person is doing, the other person is essentially holding that space of that invisible infinity that allows you to kind of dissolve all your emotions, tensions into that space. And that is what the art of facilitation requires you to be. It requires you to be that invisible infinity that is holding an invisible sacred space. So, just like there are physical spaces, there is your room, just like there is an inner space, what goes on inside of you, similarly there is a group space, which is an invisible space, and as a facilitator it is your responsibility to keep it secret, to sanctify it, to make sure that it is a real space that is held in a way that it is treated as sacred. So that's the other aspect. Just like physically you have temples, or in Auroville we have the very beautiful Matra Mandir, which is our center, which is our sacred space. Similarly, a group also has a sacred space. If you tune into it, you will be able to tune into that interpersonal reservoir, and energetically you will sense that group energy, you will sense that group space. And how do you keep that space pure? And that's where the first thing which comes is inviting the divine. Now, inviting the divine in that sacred collective space begins with inviting the divine inwardly, within oneself. So that then the sacred space as a group becomes an extension of one's inner space. So the more one is able to invite the divine within oneself, which is making sure that, can I keep my inner space, clean, in terms of whenever there's a negativity or a anger or fear that happens, I observe myself, I keep a check on it, and I do not allow that to kind of affect my actions and my even before actions, my thoughts and emotions in the moment. So that's the inner work which is required in order to hold space as a facilitator. And then as a facilitator, you are facilitating the progress. So you as a facilitator are the one who's responsible to kind of see that there are structures being adhered to, that the structures are there to facilitate the progress. If, however, you feel that the structures you put in the place are now becoming a dam or an obstacle, it's your responsibility as a facilitator to put them to the side for the time being. For instance, if you gave your students a certain project work and you set a certain guidelines, but you can see the 50% of the group is unable to adhere to 50% of your guidelines, then it's your responsibility to not give so much of importance to the guidelines that you put in place, but rather to put the progress of the group at the forefront, and in that context readjust the structures which have been put into place. And once you have the focus on inviting the divine and facilitating the progress, that is when you begin to cater to individual needs. Now that's the essential tension. Now in the context of mainstream education, actually the individual needs are just not taken into account. Everybody is kind of treated like it's a factory education system. And in integral education, it's exactly the opposite. Each individual is a unique soul with a unique gift to come into being, into life. And the struggle in the first one would be to really pay attention to each individual's needs, and particularly if you have an existing curricular structures into place, then that is the challenge that you have. On the other hand, if you are coming from more of an alternative setup, the struggle more so is that because there's so much of importance given to the individual that it does not become giving too much of importance to the individual ego. When we say that the individual has to be given importance, it does not mean that the individual ego has to be boosted and given a lot of importance. No, what we mean is the genuine actual needs of the individual in the context of progress. So this aspect of freedom to individuality comes within the context of progress, and that must never be lost as a focus. Next, I feel like at the center of all the things that I spoke about, in the sense of really being able to hold space as a facilitator that magic can flow, the first and foremost thing is the aspiration of the learner. So it's extremely important. It's in fact the bottom line of things is that you have taken into account the aspiration of the learner. Is the learner studying the course because of one's inner calling, because there is a fire inside burning, or is it for outer reasons? Similarly, if there is a project work, has the learner chosen that project work because this is a topic which is alive in that learner's life, or is it something which is just kind of top down passed to the learner? So aspiration of the learner is extremely critical to be able to hold space in a way that the magic can flow. Then the other aspect is to embody what you say, and that's the critical aspect. You can only communicate. Actually, words is only one way of communication. Essentially, what you're communicating is an energy, and that energy can only flow when you really truly embody what you're saying. If that is not the case, if you do not embody what you say, then it's not going to land. It's like, it's not a new idea that education should not just be focused on the mind, that it has to be holistic. Now, this is something that has been said for ages altogether. But why is it something that we don't actually see it? The reason is, or one of the main reasons is because it is only being said. Again, the format in which it is being said is mental. Again, it is being said without having to make that effort, make that journey, make that tapasya to actually embody what one is saying. Now, having said that, it does not mean that, when you say something, you've perfectly, fully, in all the cells of your being, you've embodied it. But even if you are up on the path of progress, even if you are aspiring to embody what you say, actually the learner can see it. The learner can really sense it that, this is a person who's only mentally delivering stuff, only intellectually telling me what to do, what not to do, giving me advices. And when a facilitator actually is seeking to embody what he or she is talking about, it is then that the learner is inspired. And that is the critical shift when we shift towards integral education. It's a shift from imposition to inspiration. And you can only inspire when you seek to embody. And the next is, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So that's another important thing to keep in question. I think I mentioned before also that there is an invisible space that you're holding as a facilitator. And it's important to remember that whole is a very real, actual whole, which is more than the sum of its parts, meaning which is more than the individual students. So individual students are there, but there is a group soul, there is a group energy, which is more than simply making sure that individuals' progress is taken care of. There is something which is happening which is beyond it, which is more than just the individual progress, which is the collective progress. So it's important to keep that lens in mind. Now, once again, each individual is unique and has a gift. I think I've repeated this point several times, but maybe since this is an important point, I'll repeat one more time. Each individual is unique and has a gift. So that's very, very critical to integral education, and which is why it's extremely important as a facilitator to pay attention to individual needs, to pay attention to the individual aspiration. But at the same time, this line should not be interpreted to mean that each individual should be given the freedom to follow one's impulses and desires. The freedom is not the freedom to follow or to dump oneself down in one's consciousness. And that is where the importance of structure and discipline lies in. But that has a place, and then there is the place for the individual to remember that each individual actually has something extremely unique and beautiful to bring to the forefront. That there is actually not, this is the first grader, this is the second rank and third rank, that each individual has something in which that person is the first rank. And it's your job as a facilitator to help discover that, to help see that. And that becomes especially a challenge when some of the students are acting tough or are difficult to handle. to keep the focus. No, there is something unique, there is a gift in each individual, and how can I hold the space better? And having said that, also not allowing some of the focus on individual to become like, you're taken for granted as a facilitator, that because it's coming from a certain sense of confusion, impulses, desires, and because in integral education we value the individual so much that it becomes about valuing the individual ego. Dissolution of the ego in love. I feel like facilitation is a great sadhana onto itself. I mean, somewhere the founder of integral education says that being a teacher and a parent, these are two roles that really require you to be at the top of the game as a yogi, as a sadhak, and which is why I feel like facilitation and education is an incredible space to learn to dissolve the ego. It's an incredible space. I mean, this is a space where you will reap more results than you will reap when you're meditating. Believe me, honestly, because this is a space where you have to hold space in a way that you embody love. Because if you do not hold space as love, then you're going to be holding space from that sense of I. Until you're holding space from that sense of I, or from that sense of the ego, you will not sense the collective energy. You will not be able to hold the sacred space for the group. So it's really a space for you to dissolve the ego, to really create space in which all that exists is love. And one of the ways to do it is to keep a check on the ego whenever your way of entering a learning space is coming from what do I do? What is it I want to teach? Or what is this? If it's too much centered around I, then it's clear that it is around the ego. However, when the question that you're asking yourself is, when I enter this space, what is it that needs to be done? Irrespective of the I, what is it that needs to be done? That's when you can begin to enter that space of love. That is when you can begin to dissolve the ego in that love and hold space as love. Now, subjective growth is important. This is another aspect, because in academics, the subjective part of things is not given that kind of an importance. It's more of the objective progress made, completion of project, examinations, assignments. These are the kind of things that we use to track progress. But equally important is to track progress subjectively. The kind of impact it is happening, it is happening on the student in the process of doing this outer project. That's equally important, whether it's through sharing circles or presentations. That's an equally important aspect. And then celebrating small achievements is another aspect that helps you create a space of positive energy, because rather than focusing on what went wrong, because there in life things are always going wrong, consciously and dedicatedly focusing on the small achievements. That is another very small point, but it can really help keep the energy of the group. So celebrations, small little celebrations on inner growth, on outer growth, on growth of the progress, that's an important element to bring within the learning space. And then let your service be an act of love. You're a mother birthing without claiming anything. Now that's the beauty of being a facilitator. Your actual role is really, like how a child is formed in the womb of the mother. Similarly, your actual duty in that sense is to be that invisible womb for something to birth. And if you can do that without even claiming the role of, parenthood or teacherhood, that's where, you begin to flow as service. Because what you're actually trying to do is you're trying to create space for something new to take birth. And in that sense, you're lending your womb, but you do not claim that, this is my womb. And the reason why you don't claim, because it is really not yours. Because it is really the hand of nature or life which is making things happen. Now, the real success of a course is actually after the course. Often we get too caught up into the indicators, which is a part of the course, whether the project work happened on time, this deadline, that deadline, this coursework, that coursework, assignment, la 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 la. But and all of that is important, not to kind of miss out on those things. But at the same time, remember, what you are doing is actually you are catering to the seed, and the seed is in the direction of what happens after the course. So if you've managed to create a course that helps make a learner into a seeker, that makes a learner inspired to serve, that makes a learner who is able to freely progress, that makes a learner who has the fire and the self-drive, that is when you've done your job. So the real results of your education is not the marks in the examination. It is what happens 1 year, 2 years down the line after the course has taken place. That's the real success. That's the sustainable success that we are aiming at. Another point is to give project works that are real. Now, this is another thing that can actually instill a good combination of rhythm and flow, discipline and freedom in the students. One is to let the students choose the project works, and of course to really enable as much learning as possible through project work, because project work is something that makes a learner into a doer and learn by actually getting one's hands dirty, by actually doing things. And maximum amount of learning happens when you actually do, and you can notice it in your own context. It's not when you were giving that examination or that degree that you were learning the most. It's when you are on the job, when you have a thing to do, that is when you're learning the maximum. So learning by doing is an incredible way, and that is where you can bring in a good combination of discipline and freedom. So where you bring freedom in project work is, what is the project work that a student does? That must always be the choice of the learner, because that really has to come from an inner calling. The second aspect of it is whether this project is a theoretical abstract exploration which has its own place, or the project is something which has an application in the real world. Because the moment you give a project which has an application in the real world, there is an entire context for a student to respond to. And that context really helps instill a certain discipline. So I really from the bottom of my heart encourage giving actual real life projects. On one hand, letting the student choose the project, but on the other hand also giving real life projects and not just theoretical abstract projects. Now, in all of this, and now we are beginning to kind of conclude, remember, you are the invisible container. So now in this presentation, you saw that as a facilitator you're doing so much. Actually, it takes a lot from a facilitator to actually hold space, but the important thing is to still remain the invisible container. So be quiet and be vigilant, and never have that sense of doership that I am the one who's doing it, because your exact role is to facilitate, to be that invisible container. Because when people look at a river, they do not look, this is the banks in the river. The people just say that this is a river. And that's what you want people to say. When they look at the product of integral education, they simply see that flowing river. And you are the banks of the river that is allowing that river to flow. Yes, I mean, this is a little slide again to show that in the essentially the fact that sometimes people say that within structures you cannot go deep, but actually you can go deep within structures, and you can flow as a river when there is a bank. In fact, you can only flow when there is a bank, and one of the classic examples of it is TED, that you can actually go deep in 20 minutes, just that it takes a lot of practice in order to be able to do so. I'm going to skip this slide because there's a lot of text on it. Essential thing that I'm trying to communicate through this slide is that there is a dance. On the left hand side you see is the freedom, and on the right hand side you see is discipline, and in between is the schedule. And your schedule actually is the point where the discipline and the freedom kind of begins to come together. So let the schedule birth from a harmony between a myriad of factors, but most of all the flow of learning best suited for your learner. So that the schedule is where it's the invisible rope that you're using to keep things on track. So schedule is something, one may see that it's such a simple thing, but it's this simple thing that actually helps balance the freedom and the discipline. Now I'm actually not going to go into, because I covered all of this previously, which is essentially there's a tension between the mainstream system, which has a tendency towards being top down, authoritative, structures overrule, inner life is throttled, there's work, 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 and then there's no life, no time for chilling. And then there's on the other side the aspect of misunderstood freedom, which is chaotic. There is impulse that is ruling, the outer life is a mess, and then there's a lot of chilling happening but no work. Whereas what we are trying to get here is the integral, which is the process of coming from inside out, which is a harmonious process. It is neither authoritative or chaotic. There is a structure which is a delightful anchor. There is freedom, which is the joyful progress. And work is life, and life is work. I'm now going to go through this slide. With that, I guess I'm going to conclude with saying that integral education will take a million forms. The important thing is you have to conceive it in your womb and make it your own. Meaning that there is no one way of doing integral education. There are as many number of ways of doing integral education as there are people. But the important thing is to not lose sight of the goal, and in the context of the goal, to have the structures that can allow the flow to happen. So with that, I conclude and I open for questions. I see that there are many questions on chat. Kiran, how do you want me to go about the questions? Should I?
You can see the questions, Divyanshi.
So yes, there is Jiddu who's asking, sometimes overflow can create new banks. So does this model allow for flow to create new structure, or does the structure remain constant and unchanging? I feel what a beautiful question, Jiddu. I mean, this is a very, very beautiful question, and thank you for putting it here. You have to look at the nature of the flow. Meaning sometimes it's basically a cyclone and a tsunami which is coming, and that is where you need to contain it. And sometimes it is, the new shores are getting created, new banks are created, which is when you develop a structure along with your learner, which is when you flow with the learner in order to create something new. So that is for you as a facilitator to sense. Now, having said that, I agree that sometimes even tsunamis and cyclones do good in the long run, but that's not the only way to progress. The only way to progress is not through a turmoil and overwhelm and pain and suffering. And you can make the progress in a way which is harmonious. So of course, it depends on for you to kind of see what is the nature of the flow. And one way of testing it is purely at an energetic level. Say, when that overflow is happening because of, say, the desire or an emotional outburst, or, things that are pulling the energy down of others, then it's an indication that, you need to be that bank that is able to contain it. Whereas there are times when that overflow is happening because there is behind it a certain fire, a certain aspiration for a higher ideal, which is when you need to be open to, let's create new structures, because it is coming and it is born out of a higher ideal and a higher aspiration. So the test is for you to be able to see whether things are coming from, largely speaking, the psychic or the vital. And that's where, you see whether you allow it to overflow and create a new path altogether, or you contain it. Next question is, what does it mean to be invisible? So Jyotirmay, facilitator or teacher is also a role which can also boost a lot of your ego. And especially if you're a good teacher, you're likely to get a lot of compliments and things like that. And it's likely to make you feel like, I am the one who's making things happen. And, there's a grandeur around the ego that gets built. So what it means to be really invisible in that sense, it's not. The entire damn process of learning is not about you. It's important to remember that, and to put yourself to the side and be like, I am here to hold space for learning to happen. For that to happen, what needs to happen. So it's not in that sense also about what is it that I want, because the moment you have a lot of clinging on to what is it that you want, you won't be able to see the emergence which is trying to take see the impetus of your learners. You won't be able to see that, where is it that river wants to flow. So that is what I would say is it means to be invisible. Then Rashmi Mohindra, how rigid, flexible should the structure be to allow accommodation of varied needs of different learners? That's an extremely good question, Rashmi. Certainly it should not be rigid. That's, I think, the basic thing. It should not be rigid, but it should be solid. So there's a difference between being rigid and solid. If things become too tight and rigid, then the flow just cannot happen. However, if there is a certain solidity, the banks are there where they are at, then it can allow the flow to happen. So I would say that, of course, it's a moment-to-moment sensing. And on the side of flexibility also, it should not become so flexible that, things should be flexible and solid. The important thing is, where are the needs of the different learners emerging from? And that is where your own process of self-observation and self-growth comes in. Because the more you're going to grow in yourself, the more you're going to see that, what kinds of energies or what kinds of thoughts and feelings comes from different parts of being. And that will allow you to be able to sense as to, is it a real need of a learner, or is it, an excuse or bahana? So any need which is really coming from a deeper aspiration of the learner, that you try and accommodate as much as possible. And that may involve even breaking all structures for that matter. But you accommodate every real deeper aspiration towards progress. But at the same time, there may be some needs which are coming because I feel lazy to get up in the morning, and that's where, you have to be like, okay, let us collectively look at how we can shift from resistance to receptivity. And that is where you create a context where each learner is a learner on the path of self-growth. Now, this is not something that I can tell somebody that, you are coming out of laziness, which is why, you're asking me this thing. But what I can do is I can create a context as a facilitator where each person is looking at one's own growth and to be able to overcome one's own inner barriers. And that is where I am also dedicated to overcoming laziness, and my learners are also dedicated to overcoming laziness, and they are also becoming more and more self-conscious. I am also becoming more and more self-conscious. And there may be times, of course, even when you create, a context of self-growth and self-learning where people mistake needs. Something may be coming out of laziness, but the person really feels this is coming out of my deeper need. And that is where, you have to form a certain relationship with your learners to be able to hold space for them in a way that they realize, for themselves as to what is coming from where. The best insight is something that, they get for themselves. And that is what I mean by holding space. And sometimes it would just mean as a facilitator for you to just call up your student and just listening. Because in the process of deeply listening, the person will be able to point it out by himself or herself that, I'm trying to fool myself. So yeah, that's what I have to say. With that, I'll move into the next question, which is, how can a facilitator guide a learner towards the inner burning light, or how can a facilitator help a learner discover the light? Now, that's basically you're asking me what is integral education. That's everything under the sun that you do in integral education. So how can a facilitator guide a learner towards the inner burning light? The first step, the first and foremost thing is, are you in the process of discovering your own truer, deeper self? Because if you are in that process will teach you a lot of different things. And in that process of the things that it will teach you, it will actually teach you what are the techniques that work, what are the times that, when you are fooling yourself, and what are your barriers to reaching that inner light. So in that process, you're going to discover a hell lot of things. And that becomes your toolkit, that becomes your toolbox to be able to share with your learner. So that's one aspect, which is, as a facilitator, am I on the journey of discovering my inner burning light? That's the first aspect. Now, the second aspect is that even if I am on my journey, what is important is when I'm engaging with the group and with a group of students is One, giving students that choice or that opportunity to be able to make choices from a deeper space. So, in fact, really encouraging, say for instance, if there has to be project work, then really truly encouraging that the project work comes in alignment to one's deeper values. I mean, there are lots of frameworks today available to be able to discover one's deeper soul values as opposed to social values, and to make sure that, the project works are in alignment to those values. And values then become like a little frame that is an indicator that something is coming from that deeper light. So allowing your learner to make choices from one's aspiration. And then the third is making sure that once a student chooses something from one's aspiration, you are there to hold space to make sure that the person is able to face challenges on the path and get through. Of course, the learner will have to walk the path by oneself, but you are there to kind of support that journey, because the more the learner is going to live and do things from a space of depth, from a space of inner light, the more the inner light is going to get strengthened. And the third is to encourage a culture of self-observation and self-awareness. I mean, in a group or in a learning space, when you're able to say that, I got up late in the morning out of laziness, that is an indicator that you've created a space where somebody is able to own it up. Generally we say I got up late in the morning, or in fact we rather don't even say that I got up late in the morning. We make an excuse just so that the other person doesn't even know. So if you can create an honest space of self-awareness and sharing, that is another aspect, another way that can help the learner get to the inner light. Because the learner will see more and more what is not that inner light. Because oftentimes we mistake our outer emotions, our outer impulses and desires for that inner light. And that's a big blunder. So the more you can create a space of self-awareness, of open-hearted sharing, the more it will happen. With that,
so actually we can take one more question, because it is time also. So, and then we wind up the session. Bhanu Singh ji is asking, everyone has different and unique ability. So how can we channelize the energy of student?
Okay. Everyone has different and unique abilities, so how can we channelize the energy of students? I'm not exactly sure what it means. Everyone has different things. How can we channelize the energy?
So, I think it is Bhanuji's suggestion is like differentiated learning program can help in catering to the abilities and learning.
So one is so this is an important, I think I got it now. So there are two things to remember. See, in the mainstream, the unique ability is not given. I mean, I would say next to negligible kind of importance is given. But when we are really truly looking at that unique and different abilities, there are, I would say, 3 stages. So stage number 1 is when, it's like a mass consciousness, that the uniqueness of individual is not at all taken into account. Now stage number 3, I'll come to the stage 2 because that's the bridge. Now stage number 3 is when each learner is fully self-driven and is able to chart one's own way around one's unique core. Now between these two is where most of the integral education happens. The third stage, I would say, is the stage of free progress. The first stage is pretty much like the mainstream. The second stage is where a lot of integral education intervention has to happen, which is that each one has a unique ability, but at the same time there is a huge lot which is common. And in the common things is where you kind of hold a structure, and within that structure, if you're able to, in any subject, whether it's integral psychology or in media or in architecture, if you can get to the essentials of it, then that is something which is useful for everybody. And that is where you hold your anchor. So you anchor yourself in that space, that which is unique to everybody. Say for instance, if I'm holding a course on integral studies, then discovery of the psychic is unique to everybody. So I weave my course around that which is common, and that becomes my anchor. Now once I have a solid anchor, once I have that solid thing that is able to bring the students together, it becomes easy for me to bring divergences. It becomes easy for me to kind of, allow students to give expressions in their own unique different ways. So that's how I would say is to not fall into either stage 1 or stage 3, but really have when you're looking at uniqueness, you look at what is your solid anchor, and on the basis of that solid anchor, you give space for each individual's unique needs. And there you can infinitely experiment. Say for instance, you can enable a lot of peer-to-peer learning, and each one's unique ability is also something that can really enrich the group. Say for instance, if I am doing sports and somebody else is learning about design, then if I share about sports, somebody else shares about design, and we learn from each other. And that's why you can create an actual sense and a space of abundance. And that is also related to the first principle in that sense of integral education, that you're a facilitator, you are a helper. And as facilitators, you don't need to know everything. So now if in a group, there are 20 different people with 20 different abilities, I don't need to be like, oh, I need to know it all. No, I need to know the foundation of the subject in which I'm dealing. And within that, I need to be open to learning. Maybe the student has something to teach me, even though I am quote unquote a doctorate or an expert in that subject. I should be able to see myself as a learner in that space. So I guess, yes, with that, I'm going to end. I see a lot more comments and questions, but I don't think we have the time to address that. But feel free to write to me. My email ID, I can just put it on the chat, and if there are any follow-up questions, I'm very happy to take. With that, you, Kiran.
Yeah, thank you, Divyanshi. It is wonderful and crystal clear, presentation and explanation both. It brings so much clarity that structure and flow goes hand in hand. I don't know, every time whenever I think about integral education, that image comes in my mind of the seed. Seed has its own potential, and it has its own power, and it germinates by using its own power and takes everything from the environment and becomes really beautiful tree. So our students are like that seed, and if our flow and structure goes hand to hand and we can give the environment to our students, I think it will fulfill integral education's core idea. I'm so thankful, Divyanshi ji, and so thankful to all participants. There are many participants who have appreciated your lecture here today, and many questions are left. So we'll try to answer through the mail, or Divyanshi ji will be able to answer many questions of yours. Again, I sum up here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Divyanshi, for coming here.